So this evening's lesson, afternoon's lesson, is thinking about what is it in our lives that influences us, or who in our lives. So the thought of the influence of a few. As we look through this, one thought I had was for us to think about what is it that brought us to where we are today. Who helped bring us to where we are. We think about, we can talk about our professional careers. We can talk about our lives, and we can see role models. We can see people that have reached out to help us along the way. Do we also give the same credit to those who have helped us along our Christian pathway as well? And just the thought about the few influences that can be for good. And so we look at a couple of verses that are in sections for kind of the introduction of this, and I've got a typo on this first line right here. It's actually Matthew 13, 31 through 32. It's kind of hard to go. It wouldn't make as much sense if you went backwards for 10 verses. I'd have no idea where 21 came from. But Matthew 13, 31 and 32 is a very short parable that Jesus gives. And it says, "Another parable he put forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in its branches thereof." And that's all he says about it. That is the whole parable. So that sounds like a great idea of an influencer. It has such a small piece, can grow to be so big. We can also look at, and we will at a few points, is look at Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter of faith. Look at those men of faith. Through faith, they did these things. How much do they influence us still today? And James chapter 5, verse 16 says, "The effective fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." One person with effective fervent prayer is giving that much right there. So really, how many times has the fate of many been changed because of the influence of a few? I think of several different movies that are out, and one in particular where there's a catastrophic event about to happen. The world's about to be at war with everybody, and there's two people that know what has to happen. And what happens to one of them? Something, plot twist, change up. They're not able to continue. So one person has to make it to some place to get this vital piece of information to stop the world from dying and ending. Where would Hollywood come up with something crazy like that? Maybe the ideas come from some of the things that we even looked at this morning's lesson of the few. And even in some here where we have a few people that are good, that are able to outweigh the evil that's going on around us. One of our first examples, and there's several examples listed that we'll go through and look at each one of these as a influencer for future events. And they're in no particular order, but the first one being Noah. From Genesis chapter 6 through chapter 9, we see Noah going through the process of being a great influencer for life to continue, for human life to continue. These events had to happen, and Noah himself had to be the influence in the area around him. And we find that influence in Genesis 6, verse 8. Where it says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was in such a wicked generation that it repented God and grieved him." He was about to destroy the world, and we see that he destroys all life through the great flood. But in this one verse, he sees Noah. We see that Noah found grace in his eyes. Because of that one thing, humanity continues. Out of all the people alive, only 8 were saved from the flood. And we see that in Genesis 7:13, where it lists the people that were actually saved. In that day entered Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them. The influence that Noah had may not have reached out through his 100 years of preaching to the world around him. But within his own family, he had that influence for those people. So he had a total of 8 people getting on the ark. And from those 8, we now have the rebirth of humanity. You know, when the water subsided, humanity was able to re-flourish and go against the earth again. We see his influence today. It still shines upon us whenever, we just had the rain. If we happened to be outside and the sunshine was out and we saw a rainbow, God instituted that rainbow with Noah. And it is for a promise, a visual of the promise. And we can go into that, and I've looked at it in times past, where it was a reminder to the people, and God even said it was a reminder to him when he saw it, that he would never again flood the earth to kill all things. So we see that in Genesis 9:8-17. The influence that Noah had in catching God's eye saved the human race, and we have a sign of that again today. When we see the rainbow, what do we see? Do we see just some pretty colors in the sky? Or do we see the promise of God that came from a man of influence in that time? Another way to look at it, perhaps. Another person of influence would easily be Abraham. He's well known and credited as being the father of the faithful. In Hebrews 11, starting in verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And when he went out, not knowing where he went, by faith he sojourned in a land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him to the same purpose. For he looked for a city which hath foundation, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength and conceived seed, and was delivered a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even one, and him as good as dead. So many as the stars of the sky in the multitude, and the sands by which the sea shore innumerable." Several points here about Abraham. His descendants would be numberless. We see that here. We see that also back in Genesis, and I've got the verses listed out of where those promises were given to him. He was told, step outside your tent, look in the sky, and try and count the stars. We talked about that at lunch, of how much clearer the sky is in different parts of the world, and even of this nation. We're used to the city life, even though this is not a big city of Indianola. It still has enough light to drown out some of the beauty of the night sky. Think about even just what we can see. Can we count all the stars? Looking at the descendants, and all because Abraham and Sarah believed in God. Okay, there was a little bit of questioning then about that, because they were up in age, but yet they still had their faith and belief. And because of that, we were able to have Isaac, and then Jacob, and then we'll see that coming up. We see all of this transpiring because the faith that he had. If Abraham didn't have that faith to believe and trust in God, God said, go to this place. So he packed up and went. Go to this place. He packed up and went. Go here. He packed up and went. All these things transpired in his life that generations have seen. We see constantly throughout the Bible the God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was such an influence of his faith in believing in God that so many, even us today, could take note of that commitment. Think about the influence that he must have had with God. When the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were about to be destroyed, God told Abraham that was going to happen. And Abraham started to reason with God and try to see if he could not have it happen. Could we save these two big cities? And we started off as, for God, for 50 righteous men, would you hold off your destruction? And we see verse after verse after verse. It went from 50 to 45, 40, 30, 20, for 10. Now, he couldn't even find 10 righteous in the city. If his own family members that were in that city, Lot, his sons, their wives, if that family group would have even been, that would have been the 10. But it was not. However, the focus of this one, the influence that Abraham had in trying to work all the way down from two giant cities filled with sin to only find 10 people and he would stay the entire destruction of both, that's impressive if we look at it from that point. And of course, started mentioning about the family line of Abraham as it went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and each of them was a tribe of Israel. And then through his lineage down to David, the prophecies bringing down to the great king of David, then down to Jesus himself. Through that influence, if he had not been faithful, then what? If all these things had not transpired, the influence that he had, the influence of all these men coming down through the ages. Moses, another man that we can look at influencing. Hebrews 11, starting in 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months from his parents, because they saw he was a godly child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he came to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for just a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And it continues and continues. By faith they kept the Passover. By faith passed through the Red Sea by dry land, by which Egyptians, saying to do, were drowned. The faith and the influence Moses had. Moses had the easy life when he was in Pharaoh's household. He was faring very sumptuous. He had a want for nothing. But when he saw the mistreatment of the Israelite nation, he stepped in. And took himself out of that position of comfort. It led him down a path to where he helped take and bring the entire nation out of Egyptian bondage. And then in Numbers 14, he also was able to reason with God to not destroy the entire nation. The influence of one man. Each of these men are just one person. But what is the similar characteristic that we see throughout each one? Their righteousness. It's not that they are righteous, but the righteousness that they portray. They follow God. They are looking with a pure heart towards God. He could have easily overlooked what was going on. He could have kind of made a comment, maybe we ought to go a little easier on him while he stayed in the palace. He could have had a very great life. Instead, he was wandering the wilderness because he saw the bigger picture and tried to share that with those around him. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, spent about 40 years in service, and if you look at it, it talks about how heartfelt that service was, how it pulled at him that people were not listening. Elijah thought at one point he was alone, but God told him there were more that had not bent their knee to Balaam. All of the prophets could be listed. Each one has their own place in this. So many people could be listed here. Josiah, about the boy king. He took and was king at 8 years old. By the time when he was 12, he sent a messenger to Hilkiah, the high priest, to count the treasury of what has been delivered there. Something that Hilkiah, now I've got this listed as being Josiah, but really it should be Josiah and Hilkiah. Because when we look at what Hilkiah did, when he was in the temple looking and finding, he found the laws, as were there, the book of the laws in the house of the Lord. So inside the tabernacle, he found a copy of the laws. What did Hilkiah decide to do with them? He looked at them, recognized what they were, and sent them back and said, the king needs to hear this. And they read it back to the king. So then Josiah heard all these things and immediately took heed to it. What would we do at 12 years old? We heard that the whole nation has been, and the king before me has not been doing his job. I have not been doing my job, and the entire nation is at risk. At 12 years old, what would we do? And Josiah says, plead to the Lord and find out what we must do. And he took that nation and put them on the pathway to reform and go back to God, and went out and destroyed the idols in the land. The influence that one man had as king at 12 years old reversed a possible destruction of the nation by putting them back on path. The last influencers, I have to put it as a plural on this one, is think about Christ came and gave us the laws more perfectly. He brought the sacrifice. Definitely he could have easily put him on this list. I don't have enough paper to describe how much of an influence he was. But he influenced 12 men, his closest, as apostles. They went on to becoming great multitudes just from 12. First gospel sermon in Acts 2 brought about 3,000 obeying and joining into the Christian age. And then we see, continuing on in Acts 6, 7, and in other places, that there were great multitudes obeying. Because one man came, taught 12, and those 12 continued that influence. If those 12 decided to just sit down, what would have happened? We see so many different encouragements. Even Paul, one person, he gets quite a bit of focus as he wrote several of the epistles in the New Testament, but look at the book of Timothy. One man encouraging and influencing another to do great things. Paul gave Timothy, a young preacher, so many encouragements throughout those 2 books. We think of all these things. Who has influenced you? Have any of these in the Bible influenced you? Who here, who in your lifetime? And we can continue that question by saying, who have you influenced? As we think about it, Noah and his family saved the human race. Abraham gained promises from God. Josiah, at 12 years old, led the reform back to God for an entire nation. And 12 men turned into uncountable numbers. How many people can, as just one person, can do such great things? Saying that goes around is that you may be the only Bible some people ever read. So if they get the cover preview, we go into a bookstore and look at a book, and we look at the cover, we look at the pretty picture on the front, maybe we read the introduction. That is them looking at you and the way you live when the first time they meet you. Based upon that impression, would they want to know more? If you are the only Bible that some people see, will it be a favorable impression? Will you leave an influence on them? We want to be of influence to others because Christ was an influence to us. We want them to see God through us. So as we live day by day, will we have the influence that little tiny mustard seed has going into the ground? When we get started, we don't have much, but we have the potential to grow, to be so much, and to help others. We influence by all of the things that we do and say. If we need it to help others, if you need help in helping others, if you need help yourself, let the congregation know. We're here to help one another. We're here to support one another, and hopefully to help influence each other for good. Notice the only examples I used in this sermon about influence of a few are those of a positive nature. We can find influences of the other style here as well, but those are actually examples of what not to be. So we want to focus on being the positive and being that light in the community. Let's do that. Let's try and help each other do that, and let's help influence those around us. If anyone does have needs of the invitation, we ask that you come while together we stand and sing.